And there you go.
Great, thank you. So today we're going to share some top line findings from our research. We can jump to the next slide, Coco. I'll start us off with a bit of introductions and kind of context setting to share a little bit about what motivated this research in the first place. Then I'm going to pass it off to Coco, who's going to take a deep dive into the research, highlighting the three big myths that emerged in our research about Americans of faith, why it's important to address these myths or misperceptions, and strategies that we can use to hopefully help overcome them in the future. And then, as we mentioned before, love to open it up for Q&A to get your ideas, your feedback, to kind of start to think through how, if at all, this research might be useful in the important work that you all are doing. Before I dive into that, just wanted to offer a little bit of background or context on More in Common for those of you who aren't familiar. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and civic organization. So our mission at the heart is really to better understand the forces that are driving Americans apart, to help us find common ground, and then to bring people together to tackle shared challenges. So I think that we're perhaps best well known for our 2018 Hidden Tribe study, which introduced the concept of the exhausted majority, which refers to the majority of Americans who are fed up with polarization, who hold more flexible and nuanced views, and who believe that common ground can still be found despite what we feel might be these deepening divides. In all of the research that we do, including this report, we really aim to understand the complexities and the nuances of Americans' attitudes and beliefs. And we focus on identifying shared values, inspiring narratives, and pathways that we hope can help us overcome toxic polarization and foster communities that are more united, resilient, and inclusive. And my favorite part of this work is we don't do it alone. We collaborate really closely with a wide range of partners across civil society, politics, government, faith, education, philanthropy, and media, as we really want to make sure that our research is useful and actionable to the communities and leaders who are on the ground navigating polarization and working to hold their communities together. So lastly, just wanted to briefly highlight why did we focus on faith communities and why in this current moment. So over the past 2 years, Coco and I have had many conversations with partners and faith leaders that revealed a shared frustration. So public discourse, as I'm sure you all know and experience in your work, public discourse about faith is increasingly narrow. Media coverage often portrays faith communities as either a highly political, defined by partisan conflict and extremism, or communities that are shrinking in size and slowly fading into irrelevance. While these narratives certainly hold some kernels of truth, they miss a much larger and more important story about what it means to be a person of faith in America today. So we set out to conduct this research really to explore the impacts of polarization on faith communities, to help disentangle the complex relationship between politics and religion, to help elevate the voices of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Americans, which are the three faith communities profiled in the report, and to hopefully help identify and elevate some shared values that can bring us back together. At More Common, and Coco and I personally believe that faith communities have a tremendous potential to change the dynamics of polarization. However, right now, they're often discussed or framed as accelerants to division rather than potential off-ramps. And so if America is to overcome our deepening polarization, we believe that faith communities are a really important part of that story. And we think that overcoming polarization often starts in our local communities. That's where people have the highest levels of trust and the strongest relationships, like in our schools, in our workplaces, and in the kind of social clubs or groups we're a part of. But it also begins in these like sacred spaces, in the churches, the wards, the synagogues, and the mosques where millions of Americans are gathering each week. And so we hope over the next hour, we can offer a few additional insights, tools, and stories that can help support the critical communications work that you are all doing and help us begin to collectively reimagine the important and vibrant role that faith communities can and should play in helping us all navigate division and build stronger communities moving forward. So with that, we're going to dive into the research. I can briefly touch on our methodology, but Coco will speak about this in much more depth as we dig into the data. But the study was a mixed methods research study. So we partnered with YouGov to conduct a national survey last fall of 4,200 US adults with oversamples specifically of Jewish, Muslim, and Latter-day Saint communities. We then conducted a second national survey in January of this year, where we recontacted half of those who completed our original survey. And then to supplement some of the survey data, we conducted 17 focus groups with a diversity of Americans of faith, hoping to capture the stories and lived experience that add more kind of texture, depth, and understanding to the trends and patterns that were emerging in the data. So with that, excited to pass it off to Coco, who will dive in and share some of the top line insights.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you, Ginny, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Coco Xu. I came to the RCC convention in Kentucky in April, so some of you might already know me. But back then, we were talking about research on polarization, and in September, we released this new report. So I'm really excited to share with you some new findings on religious communities and what misperceptions and myths are out there about faith in America. So to study misperceptions, we use this framework called perception gap. So perception gap is the difference between what we think one group believes in versus what they actually believe in. And using this framework, we found that there are three big myths about faith in America. The first one is that faith is driven by politics. This trend to view faith communities mostly through a political or partisan lens is often very visible on social media. Here we analyze the words most commonly paired with evangelical Christians, Jewish Americans, and Muslim Americans across social media platforms in the past 2 years. And as you can see in these word clouds, the words most commonly associated with these communities are often political, so referencing political leaders and party, and very few posts and discussions actually talked about the daily lives of Americans of faith or matters of theology or religious observation, or even mentioned major holidays across different traditions. And this tendency to politicize religious communities is most obviously seen when it comes to evangelical Christians. We found that Americans have huge perception gaps when it comes to evangelicals. In our surveys, we ask evangelicals, what's your most important identity? And what we found is that only 4% of evangelicals say that being a member of a political party, so being a Democrat or being a Republican, is their most important identity. But what we found is that non-evangelicals estimate that around 40% of evangelicals would say being my party affiliation is my most important identity. And this gap between the reality, the actual views of evangelical Christians, and the estimated view is huge. What we see here is a 37% perception gap. Similarly, we found that only around 1/5 of evangelical Christians agree that being a good Christian means supporting the Republican Party. But non-evangelicals estimate that over half of evangelicals would endorse this statement. We see a smaller but similar effect when it comes to Catholics. Non-Catholics overestimate the importance of political identity and Republican Party affiliation to Catholics. What we see here is only 10% of Catholics say being a member of their political party, being a Democrat or Republican, is their most important identity. But non-Catholics think that 37% of Catholics would agree. And similarly, only a small minority of Catholics would agree with being a good Christian, supporting the Republican Party. But Americans really overestimate that number. What we found in our research is that in reality, very few Americans say political identity is most important to who they are. When we ask Americans across different religious communities, what are their most important identities? Most people say religion, their family role, as opposed to a Democrat or a Republican. Moreover, political causes are not the main motivations for why people turn to their faith. In our research, we found that many Americans have this misperception that places of worship have become a political arena, but that's not true at all. Most Americans still turn to their faith to deepen their relationship with God, to find comfort during difficult times, as opposed to express their political views. We can see here at the bottom, only 6% of Americans say they turn to their faith and faith communities to express their political views. In addition, most Americans do not consider voting habits or party affiliation to be a litmus test for what makes a good believer or what makes the key to religious devotion. What we see here is that very few, only a small minority of Americans across different traditions agree that being a good Christian and being a good Catholic, Jew, or Muslim means supporting the Democratic Party or supporting the Republican Party. And these perception gaps, these over-politicization of different religious communities actually have harmful consequences, and they do matter in our daily lives. For example, we found that the more Democrats and independents overestimate the percentage of evangelicals who are Republican, the more negatively they feel towards all evangelicals. So what I mean by this is the bigger your perception gap about evangelicals, the more you dislike evangelicals as a group, as a whole. So as you can see, this is actually a linear relationship. And essentially what this means is that animosity from Democrats and independents towards Republicans, which is a partisan animosity, is also directed towards all who identify as evangelical because of this perceived association with the Republican Party. We call this phenomena collateral contempt, which means it's the tendency for animosity towards political opponents to spill over to religious groups that are perceived to be aligned with one political team. And we see similar dynamics playing out of the collateral contempt phenomena when it comes to Catholics. So the larger the perception gap about Catholics, the more people dislike Catholics. This is particularly relevant as we think about the new administration and there's increasing media attention on conservative Catholic leaders, and which often lead to people broadly associating Catholics with political conservatism. And these associations run the risk of collateral contempt,
That's a
which
good
really
cub.
highlights the importance of correcting perception gaps, correcting misperceptions, so we can prevent the partisan polarization spilling over to our religious communities. And this as a whole really reminds us that because in our age of political polarization, we too often allow politics to be the main lens through which we learn and know about each other, when oftentimes political identity is not the most important part of who we are. The second myth that we've uncovered in the research is that faith is becoming irrelevant. Americans are often exposed to the story of how religion is in decline, but we really underestimate the importance of faith for our fellow Americans, especially to young people. This emphasis on de-churching phenomena is actually justified. There's a common perception that religious communities are in decline. And a lot of this has to do with the rise of the religious nuns. So the people who are either atheists, agnostic, or have no religious affiliation. This group has been on the rise in the past few decades. and church attendance has been in decline for some communities. But at the same time, the narrative of empty pews is not the full story at all. In conversations with many Americans across the country, we often heard that places of worship still matter. Here we see on the left-hand side, Danielle, who's a Catholic from Pennsylvania, saying that there's a big sense of community at her church. There's a lot of ways to get together besides Sunday services. And on the right-hand side, we hear from Hasina, who's a Muslim from New Jersey, saying that going to the mosque gives you a sense of community. You feel that I'm not alone here. So we can see that Danielle and Hasina come from very different backgrounds and traditions, but places for both of them, places of worship still provide very important communal spaces where they can feel accepted and be part of something bigger. Moreover, beyond places of worship, we found that faith still remains personally important to most Americans, regardless of whether they show up at a place of worship or not. We found that over 7 in 10 Americans say that being a Christian, Catholic, Jew, or Muslim is important to who they are. And you might be thinking about, what about the generation gap? Are young people particularly resistant towards religion? What we find is that actually 2/3 of Gen Z say their faith is important to them. And this number is not too far off from baby boomers, less than 10% lower than baby boomers. And in fact, talking about Gen Z, we found that they're actually more likely than any other group to say that they turn to their faith to feel a sense of belonging and to be part of a community. This is really important as we think about what is the future of faith and also about the epidemic of loneliness in American society. So as places of worship are grappling with declining service attendance, what this shows us is that they can offer young people not just spiritual connections and relationship guidance, but they also have this opportunity to provide to this younger generation a place where they can experience belonging in a community. And this is particularly urgent because as we think about the epidemic of loneliness, if people don't find belonging in a community that's healthy, that encourages important shared values, people are going to look for that sense of belonging somewhere else, which oftentimes can be online places where belonging is not based on shared values, but on shared hatred or negative sentiments. So there is really an important role that faith communities can play in adjusting or responding to the needs of this young generation. The last myth that we found about faith in America is this idea that religious people are intolerant. In public discourse about religion and public life, we often see faith being associated with fundamentalism or intolerance. For example, when we ask our research panel of around 200 Americans, what comes to mind when you see the term evangelical Christians? Often we see people use words like Christian nationalist or narrow-minded point of view. But in reality, that's very different from the actual beliefs and perspectives of those who are in these faith communities. For example, we found that around 8 in 10 Americans and the majority of different faith traditions feel that they want the US to be a place where people of all religions and no religion feel that they belong. And if we look at the lighter gray here, we can see that only 5% of evangelical Christians and only 5% of Muslims reject this vision of pluralism. So in reality, the majority of Americans support this, this ideal of religious pluralism. But again, we find huge perception gaps between the actual beliefs of different religious communities who are in favor of pluralism and others' perception of them. For example, Americans think that only around half of evangelicals and half of Muslims would support religious pluralism. In reality, we see that the majority of these two groups do support pluralism. And in addition, 3/4 of Americans, including the majority of all groups, are open to interacting with someone from a different religious background. So why this matters is that the more entrenched people's assumptions about the intolerance of other religious communities, the harder it is to build trust and connection when you feel that the other side rejects who you are and rejects your belonging in this country. So for organizations who are working on improving intergroup relations, it's really important to emphasize this common support for pluralism among Americans of both majority and minority faith groups. I just want to make 2 quick points on why it is especially urgent to correct misperceptions at this moment. The first is that a very high percentage of Americans feel under attack today. Here we see that the misperceptions and the myths that we just talked about really contribute to an environment where people feel misunderstood and judged. Around 2/3 of evangelicals feel and 2/3 of Jewish Americans feel that their religion is under attack in America. And around half of Muslim Americans and Latter-day Saints feel similarly. And very large groups, around 7 in 10 evangelicals, 2/3 of religious minorities feel that their groups are judged more than others, and they're misrepresented by political and media elites. This sense of threat and under attack is really high. The reason why we want to flag this with you all is that when decades of social psychology research shows that when people feel under attack or threatened, they go into this fight or flight mode, and it's very hard for them to engage with others when they feel threatened in more healthy or constructive ways. So it's very essential to reduce people's perceptions of threat. And one way to do that is through countering these misperceptions and building healthier communities and connections across lines of differences. At the same time, we also find that not only is it important to correct misperceptions so that people feel less threatened, there's a genuine need from Americans across different communities to be seen just like everybody else, diverse in their beliefs and traditions, but united by common values and life pursuits. For example, on the left-hand side, actually, let me see if I can play this out loud quickly. Can you all hear?
I would like all Americans to understand that just because we're Muslim Americans doesn't make us any less American than they are. We like baseball, we like hot dogs, albeit beef hot dogs. We like playing with our children. We like to do all the same things that every other American likes to do. Just we pray 5 times a day. We go to a church on a Friday instead of a Sunday. And we believe that all of us are equally, blessed and going to make it to heaven. Whereas, unfortunately.
And we can hear from Brittany, who is a Latter-day Saint from Utah.
I wish that people knew we were true Christians. That we're all just trying to be like Jesus. We want to love everybody and serve everybody, and we want everybody to live in heaven together. that we aren't, I mean, every person is flawed. We all make mistakes. At some point in time, we've all done hateful things, but that's not what we want to be, right? We don't want to be hateful. We really are just trying to love and serve.
So as you can see from these snapshots from Americans around the country, there's really a desire for people to feel seen. And as communicators in this room, this really speaks to the important work that you all do and the opportunities for elevating these voices and bringing these voices to the national discourse, countering a lot of what we're seeing, the more negative narratives on social media. And so far, we've looked at what misperceptions people have. Why is it important to address these misperceptions? I want to quickly share some insights on how we can go about correcting misperceptions. The first one is, instead of focusing on all Americans, it's sometimes more effective in zero in on the communities that are most likely to have misperceptions about different faith communities. What we found is that when it comes to misperceptions of evangelicals and Catholics, people who are more on the left in terms of their political ideology, people who are perennially online and frequently use social media are more likely to have bigger perception gap about both evangelicals and Catholics. So what this means is that targeting liberal-leaning folks, especially those who get their information about religious communities, not from personal relationships, but from social media, is perhaps most effective in correcting misperceptions that Americans have about these two communities. And conversely, we also found that when it comes to misperceptions about Muslim communities, people who are more conservative leaning when it comes to their political ideology are more likely to have bigger perception gaps about Muslims. So targeting those folks would be most beneficial when it comes to changing people's assumptions about American Muslims. And more than just countering these incorrect assumptions, one way to build lasting relations is also through elevating common ground and common values across different religious groups. For example, we find that kindness and respect for human dignity are the most important values across different communities, regardless of religion. And emphasizing these threads would be really helpful in strengthening our resilience against efforts to divide and stir up conflict and fear. And elevating a diverse range of different voices across communities to greater prominence, especially on social media, would also help with correcting misperceptions. For example, on the left-hand side, we hear from someone, Douglas, a conservative evangelical Christian from Georgia, saying that God is welcoming of different people of different political beliefs. He doesn't just love one group over another. So elevating these voices that are different from what we often hear on the news would be really helpful in changing people's mind. The last point I want to make here before passing it back over to Julia is that our research found that around half of Americans who attend religious services regularly, they are looking for guidance from their faith leaders on how to navigate political division, how to talk to people whose views are different, and how to navigate demographic or cultural changes in their local communities. So what we learned from this study and what we really want you all to take away with today is that there is a real potential here for leadership from faith communities, not to play partisan politics, but to help guide people who still turn to them with a huge amount of trust to really guide people through these deeply divided times. And this is why the work of what you all are doing is really, really important, both in terms of correcting people's assumptions, but also guiding your communities through polarization and building healthier, greater social cohesion. So with that, I will pass it over to Julia for a few last points, and then we can open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Coco. And yeah, appreciate you all being here today. And just to echo Coco, just the important work that you're doing. Coco profile, just a small snapshot of the data that's available in the report. So I can drop a link in the chat, but would encourage you all to check out our website. The report's available there to be downloaded, as well as a few subpages that take a deeper dive into data and insights relevant to each of the 7 faith communities profiled in the report. So including evangelical Christians, mainline Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and Latter-day Saints. And just wanted to end by emphasizing that we see our role here as being a resource to all of you. Really appreciate the important work that you're doing. And if there's any way that we could ever be supportive, whether that's kind of answering questions or taking a deeper dive into any of the insights today. If there are questions that you're wondering about that maybe we could embed or include in our next iteration of faith-based research, if there are resources that would be helpful to integrate into your work, would just really encourage you to send us an email. We love the one-on-one conversations and really want to make sure that our work is relevant and applicable to communities on the ground. And so always welcome any ideas on how to do that better and in more depth moving forward. So we'll pause there. Would love to open it up to any questions, reactions, feedback, discussion. Very, very open to how you all want to use the next 20 minutes. I see there are a few questions in the chat, Jenny. So should I start there maybe?
Yes, let's start there with those.
Great. Okay, Blake, are you still? I see you're still on. I'm happy to read your questions out loud, or if you want to just unmute and share what you were thinking about and what you're wondering about, we can do it that way as well.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. I'm joining at the invitation of my manager at my work, Karen Krieger, who had to jump off. We both work in Witness and Society for the ELCA. And I will put all my cards on the table. Outside of my work, I also started the Exvangelical hashtag and wrote a book that was published in September called Exvangelical and Beyond: How American Christianity Went Radical in the Movement That's Fighting Back. So that's the personal sort of perspective that I'm bringing to my questions. But I'm curious just about the framing of some of your questions about with regard to identity. And I'm not surprised that that evangelicals, having been raised in the tradition, even though I no longer identify with it, that they wouldn't identify or say that being a Republican is their most important identity. But it's pretty demonstrative that for the past 3 election cycles, they've voted one particular way, especially white evangelicals, for a particular candidate and for a particular political party, in 80+%. So I'm curious about how the language of these questions was chosen, because I think that will lead to some very different things than if you asked a different set of questions, and especially with regards to the political actions of people of faith, which is something that is an area of interest to a lot of us. I'm just curious how this focus on identity, while like sort of de-emphasizing political identity, it's still, I don't necessarily see the correlation to political choice, and some of that's where I'm having a lot of difficulty, and I'd just love to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you, Blake, for those great questions. For the first question on framing of identity and who identifies as evangelical, the way we've been categorizing our responses is through whether people answer yes or no or not sure to self-identifying born again questions. Do you identify as evangelical or born again? And we've thought about this long and hard about whether we should use theology or religiosity or self-identification. And all of them have different reasons for and are useful for many different scenarios. But the reason why we chose self-identification is because we're interested in seeing how people see who they are, and for those who adopt that label, how do they pan out when it comes to different issues. And we've also looked at the subgroup differences within who identify as evangelical. So looking at how liberal evangelicals differ from conservative evangelicals, white versus Black or Hispanic evangelicals. So there are some differences, especially huge differences when it comes to political voting behaviors, but when it comes to relationship with spirituality and religiosity, these different subgroups within evangelical Christians actually have very strong commonality. And on your point about voting behaviors, that's a really important question. And the way I've been thinking about it is actually tied to your second question in the chat. I think it's tied to the perception of threat among these communities. And what we found in social psychology research is that when people feel threatened and under attack, a lot of times people are more inclined to support figures who they consider as strong and who can protect their interests and values. And what I think is that this environment or this sentiment of feeling threatened is especially powerful. And some communities where people might be willing to forego, even though these values are central to who they are and to who they are as Christians, they're willing to prioritize voting for someone who they think can protect their values and their interests over that alignment in values. So I think it's really, in the next years to come, it would be really important to address that feelings of safety and feeling of under attack, and how we can build a healthier civic culture that's not in response to in perceived threats.
Right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think that's a very difficult task, given that a lot of these communities have been have had a lot of apocalyptic messaging for well over a century, with just the introduction of premillennialism and the way it still affects a lot of things, and just a longing for Christ's return in a sort of inherently negative view of the world. And that's very hard to reconcile or to address in a single survey, for sure. In addition to, and then I'm just really personally just so having seen so much dialogue around Christian nationalism, and the way a lot of different people have tried to address that within communities of faith, and when it comes to white evangelicals, it made no real difference. I mean, the number of votes for percentage wise that have so far been attributed to white evangelicals has stayed consistent with the last two election cycles. So that's just what my sort of thought process right now, especially. So I appreciate everything else. Thank you for answering my question.
Thank you, Blake. Really, yeah, appreciate your question, and just also you sharing your personal experience as well. It was really, yeah, excited to check out your book. I appreciate that. All right, I see we've got some questions from a question from Reverend Brian. Do you want to jump in, or happy to read it out loud?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering, you said that the people that are on social media and spend a lot of time online have a bigger perception gap. And I wonder if that is because it's, let's say this is the way it really is, and they think over here, Is that just because the people that aren't on social media don't know anything? Or what is, like, how do people not on social media have a better perception gap than the people who are all over social media?
Thank you, Brian, for that question. And I think that is also, I think that question is also based on like our assumption or hope that social media actually bring people closer, right? It allows us to meet people we don't get to meet in our circles of friends and family. But I think what we're seeing right now is that social media actually creates this echo chamber where we're still only interacting with people who have similar views and backgrounds as us. And we are also interacting with a very small but loud minority that is not representative of the communities they're from. So what we're seeing here is people who frequently use social media are more likely to have bigger perception gaps. I think what this tells us is that a lot of times people who are often on social media often get their information about communities they're not familiar with through these filtered sources, and that are oftentimes in these echo chambers, as opposed to getting information about a group through personal relationships that's more grounded in shared values and knowing who you are as a person. So what this means, I think, in my opinion, is that building lasting relationships across lines of differences is really, really important in gearing up this resilience against the more harmful narratives that we see on social media and in media narratives as well.
Well, I agree with that conclusion. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Reverend Brian. Really appreciate that question. Is it Sungmi? I see that you have a question too about new religious movements. Happy to read it.
I was just curious. I mean, I work for Family Federation for World Peace Unification, which is commonly known as the Unification Church. I understand that a lot of the research, and discussion online about faith communities is about mainstream faith communities, which I completely understand. There's not always access to new religious movements, or, it's not seen as relevant maybe to a broader audience. But I was just curious if there's ever been discussion about including them in your research.
Yes, thank you for that question. For this study, we haven't looked as closely as new religious movements, not because we think it is irrelevant. We actually think it is very relevant as we analyze both the religious and political landscape in America. But it's actually because it's very hard to sample these communities with our polling partners. So there's a lot that we have to balance, how can we reach a representative sample for these big communities, but also speak to the subgroup differences. But we would love to do more research in the future. Maybe if survey research is not feasible, it could be interesting to do qualitative interviews to get at what are the different perspectives and experiences of those communities.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Great, thank you. And Coco, I think this kind of connects to the next question from Kathy. Kathy, feel free to unmute, but you were asking, it sounds like, about the approach we used when surveying. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. I just wondered, how many people were surveyed and what the situation was. Was it via email, phone? Sometimes I think people tend to be how's the word? They tend to want to paint a better picture of themselves politically, if they think what they're going to say isn't what you want to hear. So I'm just wondering if there was any skewing of results that way.
Thank you, Kathy. That's a great question and something that pollsters and researchers have to constantly wrestle with, what we call social desirability bias. Like, are people just saying things that they think are socially desirable as opposed to what they truly feel? In terms of our sample, we have 4,200 Americans. And then in addition to that, we have 500 Muslim Americans, 500 Jewish Americans, and 100 more Latter-day Saints. Together, this is a representative sample, so we make sure we hit different recruitment targets for different demographic factors, so making sure it's representative across religion, race, gender, generation, and also region of the country. So that is a representative sample. In terms of social desirability bias, we did our surveys online. So the respondents were not being interviewed by a human. So that eliminates some of the willingness or the social desirability bias. And a lot of these folks are used to doing surveys and they know they're not being traced by the researchers. So oftentimes they're quite honest in what they share. I think sometimes it's surprising to look at these data because it's different from what we expect and what we see on the news. For me, it is a reminder that a lot of folks don't think about politics or don't use politics to view themselves. And I don't think that fully explains their voting behaviors, but it is important to acknowledge that that their political identity is not paramount or central to who they are.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. I see we have two questions from Anutama. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was right. Very good. Very good. Yeah, so the first one is just a question of are the perceptions changing over time? And it certainly seems that things over the last few years have become more polarized, but is this like the first survey of its kind? So this is kind of the baseline and we'll see what happens in the future? Or what are we comparing it to? It's kind of related to my second question. I read a couple of books that talk about historically similar, some of the points that Blake made earlier, I believe, that particularly with the evangelical community, historically, they've always kind of felt themselves a minority with different waves of immigrants and, you know, whatever, different perceptions of the elite, however those were defined in decades and decades past. So is there anything comparing how these views are changing recently? And then the second question, well, maybe answer that question first if you could.
Thank you for that question. For our study, this is our first time studying misperceptions about different faith communities. So it's hard for us to directly compare it with any longitudinal data about changes of perceptions, but we're very eager to continue this line of research so that we know maybe 2 years into this new administration, how do people feel? Do they still feel threatened? So even though we don't have longitudinal comparison within a group, I thought it would be interesting to highlight that we do have comparison across groups. So we know that most groups, including evangelicals, but also religious communities, feel under attack. But we also ask a line of question about actual experiences of threats to your safety and not willing to share having to hide your religious identity out of fear. And what we see here, there's a huge change. So everybody feels under attack psychologically, but when it comes to threats to physical safety, it is Jewish and Muslim Americans who really jump out in having a higher numbers who feel under attacks physically. So I think that kind of draws out what we're trying to pinpoint here too, that there's a difference between perception of threat, psychological threat versus threats to safety, and how faith communities can acknowledge both and not dismiss psychological threat as something that's not important, but also taking it into the context of what this means compared to what religious minorities might be experiencing.
Yeah, thank you. And then if I can just briefly, the second question was, I like the way you ended your overview with some optimistic note that many people from different traditions were looking to their religious leaders to give them some guidance during these difficult times. You pointed out three aspects of that. One, just the diversity. I don't remember the other two exactly. But I noted that you took an optimistic interpretation of that, like 47% of this group want to hear from their pastors, which, 53% don't. And it wasn't, 60 or 70 or 80%. It was right in the middle. So if you could just interpret that for us a little bit, that would be my last question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So actually, the scale for that question is agree or wanting religious leaders to provide guidance. And there's also a neither agree nor disagree, a neutral option. So it doesn't mean people who don't fall into the agree category, they're fully against it. Some of them are against it, but some of them are just, I don't have an opinion on this. So the number doesn't seem that high. We might be expecting like something in the 60s and 70s, but if we compare it with other institutions, that number is actually really high. What our research found in the report, but also what other researchers have found, is that there's a huge declining trust issue. Americans really have much less trust in American institutions around them. So and comparatively, they still have quite a high level of trust in their faith leaders. And I think that's a really important comparison and points to opportunities that faith can play a more active role in mitigating polarization.
So the message is kind of, they may not listen to you, but you have a better chance than anybody else does. So go for it.
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Exactly. And almost half want you to. So that's a good base to then mobilize the rest. Ginny, I know we're at time. We're happy to stay to answer Ryan's question, but I also don't want to derail the rest of your plans or day.
It looks like there's at least a couple more questions. If you do need to pop off, the video from today will be posted to RCC's YouTube channel, so you could always catch up at the end. But Ryan, I think you've got a question. If there's any more, we'll continue as long as Julia, you and Coco have time. So, and Michael, looks like you might have a question as well. Okay.
And Kalinda also has their hand raised. First of all, thank you both. I always find your research so fascinating. This is not my first time hearing Coco present, and I'm always excited when I get to, because I find it just really intriguing. A couple of things. One of them is, I'm wondering if you did the breakdown. I'm thinking about the perceptions versus the reality of religiosity, right? Or religion tied to political beliefs. And I note that you had the decline in different generations saying that a religion forms as a significant part of their identity, right? So the silent generation was higher than the boomers, et cetera, right? Down to Gen Z. Although, quite frankly, Gen Z was a lot higher than I thought it was going to be. But I'm wondering if you broke that down a little bit. Gen Z seems to be less tied to religion. Are they also more apt to judge? So do the Gen Z respondents, are they more apt to think poorly of other people, or to think that other people's politics play an important part of the religion than older people are? Does that make sense? So like, if I'm a boomer, I'm like, well, evangelicals, it's not a big part of their political beliefs aren't a big part of their religion. But if I'm a Gen Zer, because I might be a little bit more disaffected by religion in general, I'm more apt to identify a religion with a political party. And kind of along the same lines, if you broke down those perceptions by the religion of the person responding to it, if there was a particular religion that got it right, if they were the ones that were like, do you know what I mean? That they understood the other religions better than other, like evangelicals were more apt to understand that not everybody's politics play a part of the religion, or something like that. I'm curious about those two things. I don't know if I phrased my questions exactly right, but any insights you could give would be great.
Those are great questions. I'm so glad you asked them. I can literally pinpoint to different parts of the report. Just a little bit too long, but so I'm really glad to address those here. About your questions on young people, whether they have larger perception gap, or how do they construe their faith identity? If I'm understanding those right, we actually don't see a huge generational difference when it comes to perception gap. So we're not seeing age predicting greater misperceptions about evangelicals or about Muslims. And this is actually standard across race and across faith traditions as well. And in terms of what is the role of faith and purpose of faith for Gen Z, we see a slightly larger number. So 8% of Gen Z say they turn to their faith to express their political views. The national average is 6%, so it's only slightly higher, and that's actually within margin of error. So we actually don't see Gen Z being overwhelmingly political with their when it comes to their faith identity. They actually fall pretty much in line with the national average. What did stand out is that they turn to their faith for communities and sense of belonging. That's actually really important because the Surgeon General's report on epidemic of loneliness show that young people are more prone to loneliness and lack of community. So I think faith really has an opportunity to play a role in bringing young people into the fold. About your question about evangelicals' own perception gap about themselves, this is fascinating because we found that evangelicals also have an incorrect assumptions about their own in-group, but evangelicals also overestimate the percentage of their own group who prioritize partisan identity, who prioritize Republican Party affiliation. And to me, the significance is that reveals the in-group norms of what within evangelical communities. So for those who don't prioritize their political identity, they might assume the other people around them do that. So that kind of hinders them to speak against what they disagree with. So in reality, correcting those misperceptions within one's group is actually important if we want to build like healthier civic culture within each group.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really great question, Ryan. And Michael, maybe we can close with you.
Sorry about that. I have been growing in my sense that polarization is a form of violence, that there is a pervasive polarization at work, and with the advent of polarization comes the decline of the common good. The polarization leads to mistrust. With mistrust comes demonization of the other side, whichever one it is. And so to me, it strikes me that it's terribly important that we find ways to address the depolarization, which is one of the things that we're working at the moment. I listed a link to the production that I work on called Unexpected Peace. And there we have specific examples of how people actually were able to overcome polarization. You know, a pastor and the commander of a Islamic militia in Indonesia, for example. So I'd be really interested in exploring this further, maybe not right now, but to talk with you about some of the strategies that we're considering in developing a movement that helps address polarization. I think that even though the numbers may suggest that people don't align themselves with this or that political structure, that doesn't determine how they vote. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I think the polarization is real, and I hear it a lot coming through. I'm speaking from Canada, and so that's what I'm hearing through the media here. So I really think that it's worth our effort to find ways to address polarization, because ultimately that means building trust. It means recognizing each other as human beings first. It means that we work at finding ways to build trust that ultimately then allows us to move in the direction of building the common good. So I really believe that if you can reduce polarization, you can increase the common good, the sense of the common good, and how to build that common good. So I guess I'm coming at it from a very practical perspective, that our conversation today, while it focuses on studies and statistics, numbers, that's really helpful to me to be able to get a sense of what it is that I'm dealing with as we go about working at addressing that. But I have some specifics which I would like to talk to the two of you when we're not tying up everyone else, just to get some of your thoughts or guidance in how to engage in building a movement that addresses polarization in the good sense.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that, Coco. Sorry, feel free. I didn't mean to cut you off by jumping in, but I wanted to, I think you're preaching our language, and we feel very similarly and would love to continue this conversation. I've dropped my email address in the chat for anyone on this call who wants to kind of dig in deeper or continue to share reactions, reflections, or ideas on maybe additional research that would support your work. We would really welcome that, as we're completely agree. We see polarization as an incredibly destructive movement that's building in our country, and we need to be developing tools and frameworks and ways of speaking that help us better understand people who we perceive as different than us, where they're coming from, and then what we can then do to kind of build or create something new together. And so perception gaps are maybe one framework to do this, but there's a million other strategies and approaches, and so would really welcome the opportunity to continue thinking and exploring those.
Just a quick plug, pcci.team has a 4-step process that is designed to help Christians build trust relationships with Muslims. And so if you have a chance, check that out. I think you'll find some helpful things in there.
Well, and to me, that also shows the value of organizations such as RCC, where we can come together and share what our troubles are, what our challenges are, folks of different faiths, where we are beyond that and can work together in that collaborative spirit. So again, it speaks to where we are in this space as an organization. So Coco, Julia, thank you so much for your time, for the insight. It sounds like it's, a good base for where we are now. It'll be intriguing and interesting to see where we might go with this, because I do believe, as has been cited before, this is a challenge for our country, for our world at this time. So thank you for that. It will be posted on the YouTube channel. Julia and Coco have dropped their email address in the chat if you need to reach them. I think they're open to having continuing dialogue. So thanks again for both of you and for everyone attending today. Take care, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you.
Bye now.